During Prohibition, there were about 4,000 speakeasies in Boston. The popular term scofflaw, meaning a person who casually breaks the law, was supposedly coined in Boston.
Daddy wasn't finding a pow wow. Daddy wasn't finding a pow wow. I love my little cat. I'm very fond of that. I'd rather have a big bow wow 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 wow. Daddy wasn't
Hello, and welcome to the
finding a
Mochiverse. I'm
pow
Linette.
wow.
And I'm Skip.
Hello.
Finding a
I know
pow
the main
wow.
focus of the story doesn't take place during Prohibition, but because it started its origin as Prohibition, I figured I'd put that little fact in. I didn't know that thing about scofflaws. I'd heard the term scofflaw like used to be used in the newspaper a lot during Prohibition, but I had no idea it was a Boston thing.
Doesn't surprise me. It does,
I know
you think of
everything
it.
yeah, everything starts in Boston. We're like
Yeah,
Chekhov from
yeah,
Star Trek.
yeah,
Everything is ours.
yeah.
Oh my goodness. So, folks, hello, how are you? Today we're going to talk about not a happy subject, but something that we've been putting it off, but something we've been wanting to talk about for a while. When did we first pitch this one? It was a long time ago, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah. It's quite a while ago. It might have been when we were first, even when we were first throwing out ideas,
Yeah, you could be
because,
right.
right, because we had talked about Boston stuff and we did the molasses thing,
Right?
molasses flood. And I think you had previously done a molasses flood on another podcast.
I did,
And
yeah.
yeah, it was some of the initial pitches that we did, mostly because our focus is, Boston stuff and Boston events, the rich in history, some good, some bad.
Yeah,
So,
and they always seem to keep coming up and mostly by accident. I'm like, "Oh, this looks interesting. Oh, okay, that person's from Boston. All right."
yeah, yeah.
And yeah, and I just use the general term Boston because, everybody friggin' does that anyways. Uh, where are you from in Boston? Rowley.
Yeah, well, that's the thing, it always sort of cracks me up. You meet people and they say they're from Boston, and then when you talk to them, you find they're from Needham, and Newton, and
Yeah.
wherever. And I said, well, I'm from Boston, actually,
Yeah,
you
exactly.
know,
Actually, I
uh,
am.
and that's unique in that regard but it's easier to remember that, I'm sure it's easier to say you're from Boston. It's like, you know, saying you're from New York, even not everybody is. So,
Exactly. And Richard says Atlanta all the time, even though he didn't live in the middle of the city. He lived in like a suburb right outside of Atlanta. And
yeah.
he explains to me that most people, don't know the other towns. And listen, if I was from like Needham or Dedham or something, yeah, I'd probably say Boston. But I'm from Salem, so I just say that.
Well, that's another familiar town or
Yeah.
city. People immediately understand what Salem, the reference to Salem with the witch trials and stuff. So yeah, those are easy to tie in for people to say where to tie it into Massachusetts.
Yep, exactly. So today, folks, we're going to talk about the Coconut Grove fire. And this fire happened, I believe, in 1942.
Yep.
But the story of the business itself started during Prohibition. So we're going to go there first. So it originally opened in 1927 by Mickey Alpert and Jacques Renard, who were orchestra leaders. So they were a couple of band leaders during Prohibition. They figured, like we just talked about a few minutes ago before recording, they were just probably buddies who had worked together and decided, hey, you know what we should do? We should open a club. With all of this Prohibition stuff, there's like 4,000 speakeasies around here. Let's have another one.
Yeah, yeah.
You know?
And it's kind of like folks that are in the orchestra or working in a restaurant or somewhere, they don't particularly have the funds
Mhm.
to open the club themselves. It's just their idea, and then they pitch the idea to someone who
Yeah.
backs it.
Well, and I imagine times must have been really scary as far as financially for people like that in the entertainment industry during this time
Mhm.
because, when Prohibition was pitched, when it was proposed, and then when it started, all of the rhetoric behind it was about the demon alcohol. And it was about, a lot of the groups that were trying to get prohibition started were about like family values. And they were mostly talking about men, sort of, a lot of the feminists were talking about men beating women when they were drunk,
Hmm.
basically.
Yep.
And a lot of other groups talked about temperance. They talked about, alcohol is bad, but they didn't really consider how much money there was and how much other business there was sort of tied around alcohol, tied around businesses with alcohol. And the entertainment industry was huge with that because you have places to eat, places to go dancing. Dancing was still a huge thing, and places to be entertained. And of course, alcohol was going to be part of that because you go out for a night on the town, most people will drink. I don't do it, but a lot of people do. It's like part of your evening.
Yeah, well, that's what gets it loosened up, I guess. So,
Right, right. Yeah,
yeah.
especially during times when you're supposed to have certain manners during the day and then, get your inhibitions loosened a little bit at night. I can imagine that would have been scary for people in the entertainment industry to learn that prohibition was happening. And it's like, well, what's going to happen to us now? And I'm sure the speakeasies started small and started slow, but I mean, I hate to say it, but without the mafia,
Well, that's how they funded it. And
yeah, a lot of these people probably would have been out of work.
yep, yep,
And, I mean, the stock market crashed like the next year after this place was opened, or the year,
mm,
2 years after.
yep,
So I imagine they would have been just destitute
right.
without the mafia's help, which is really,
Yeah.
really sad. And I read, speaking of that, I didn't know if you knew this, but I read a fact like a week ago or so about Al Capone during the height of his activity. He actually ran a couple of soup kitchens,
Hmm. Okay.
which is like very interesting to me because a lot of people when they think about mafia, they might think about Al Capone, or they might think about later on with like The Sopranos and all that shit, or like The Godfather and all that shit. But during like the late 20s and 30s, yes, you've got crime. I mean, crime is definitely a big piece of it, but there's almost a sense of community there. Very interesting to hear that detail. Because I mean, you've got, people killing each other, people hurting each other, people committing crimes, people living outside the law, and yet they're like, all these people around me are starving. Let's open a soup kitchen.
Yeah, I'd probably, I mean, my best guess on something like that would be that, he was trying to ingratiate himself to the community,
True.
so that they would, they probably didn't like what he did, but that they also said, well, yeah, but he's
He's
setting this up to take care of people, so maybe he's not that bad of a guy.
That's true.
And,
That's true. It'll keep them from complaining about what's going
mhm,
on in their neighborhoods. Kind of like the Romans.
yeah,
Like I think about that funny scene from Life of Brian when, they're like, "Well, what have the Romans ever done for us?" Like the aqueduct, the roads, medicine,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
peace, the laws, education. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, I guess so. I guess that's a I guess I'm probably ignorant for not noticing that before, but
yeah.
it did kind of dawn on me in that moment. But yeah, so the Coconut Grove, it started off as like the building was originally, I think it was a garage with like a mechanics business, and
Mhm.
they turned it into multiple entertainment spaces. So in the basement, they had like an entertainment space with like a rotating stage. It had like a bar. There were restaurants there. There were multiple bars, and it was like 1.5 floors, but it was kind of like a labyrinthine maze of all these different
Mm.
rooms that you would have to navigate through.
Yeah,
The capacity of the place was somewhere around like 400 or almost
400. Yeah.
500.
Mhm.
Um, and on this night that happened in 1942, there were like over 1,000 people there. So that's one thing.
Yeah, yeah. And it's worth mentioning that. it may have started off as some primarily mob owners, but then
Hmm.
a lawyer had taken over the club and trying to de-emphasize the mob image,
Well, yes. So Alpert and Renard, they had mob connections, and it was taken over pretty quickly, by Charles King Solomon, who was like one of the big mafia guys in the area. He was killed in 1933 at the Cotton Club in Roxbury. And it was actually his lawyer who took over the business. So, yes, it was a lawyer,
mm-hmm.
but it was a mafia lawyer who took
Right,
over the
yeah.
business. It was a consigliere
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
who took over the business. His name was Barnett, or Barney Wolanski. And yes, he wanted to de-emphasize the image of the place. He wanted it to look legit. He wanted it to be classy, but
Yeah.
he definitely retained his mafia ties. He was closely associated with Mayor Tobin, who'll come into play later. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, yeah. And the thing is that even though the mob emphasis was, tried to make it more above board, there was still the political influences, which
Hmm.
think we see time to time. I mean, here was a place, a night spot that basically had no permits.
Hmm.
Renovations were done without permits, no food service permits, no liquor
No,
license.
exactly. No liquor license, even
Just
after Prohibition.
right, right, and is always the case. When people that are deal makers, they
Hmm.
make deals for stuff that may look pretty, but may not necessarily be
Yeah.
the safest, if you will, for if we talk about safety. Yeah.
And law enforcement turns a blind eye to things like that,
Yep.
especially when the mafia
Yeah.
is involved. And all of those shady deals wasn't a problem because this guy was friends with the mayor, and
Yep.
the mayor was just as corrupt. Mayor would probably show up at, yeah. And as a matter of fact, I think the mayor did go to that club often.
Yep.
So he'd be hanging out there too. So it was his night spot.
Yep.
He had hired a bunch of underage boys to work for him.
Mhm.
They were like bus boys and things like that. And one of them was actually later accused of this, but it looks like he was exonerated. But we'll get into that. Yeah. And it was a really popular night spot. I'm sure it was. So let me go in because I wanted to talk about where it was. So this was 17 Piedmont Street. It said it was located near the Park Square Theater District in downtown
Oh, okay.
Boston.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what is that area? What is that? I mean, theater district, I understand probably looks a certain way. What is that area like now?
It's still the theater district. It really is almost outward bound from Boston proper.
Okay.
Uh, there are, there's hotels in that area, but it's not, it's more heading towards the western part of Boston, West Roxbury, or the west side.
Okay.
So Tremont Street runs into that area. It's probably a block away or more from what used to be called the combat zone.
Oh, okay.
Maybe
I
maybe
see.
2 blocks at the most away from Boston Common.
Yeah, it's not far from Tremont Street.
Yep. Hmm.
It's not that far from the Back Bay.
No.
I'm kind of just looking at a map. I mean, it looks like it's probably been gentrified.
Oh, by now I'm sure it has. I don't think there's a lot of
Oh yeah, it's like
homes in
right.
that area. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like right on the Common, and Shawmut Street is right there too.
Yep. Chalmers Street runs right by the Common. So this is all like a block, you
Hmm.
know, west of the Boston Common.
Okay, so that's not, I imagine at the time, was that a rough, do you think that was a rough area in the
You know,
40s?
yeah, it might have been a warehouse area, which is what you said. I think
Right.
there'd be a lot of buildings that got converted to other stuff. I'm sure
Okay.
that a lot of the theater district are old buildings that were converted into theaters.
Oh yeah, that makes sense because
Um,
it's a big open space.
yep, yep.
And I mean, I guess even by like 42, might not have been too bad because there were plenty of like well-to-do people who were going to that club as well as regular people.
Yeah, probably, like a lot of parts of Boston, there's a lot of congestion in terms of parking and stuff.
Mhm.
Sure I know they weren't parking garages at that point.
No, probably not. Probably not. The train lines were probably more.
Yeah, and it might have been some difficulty, which is a lot of parts of Boston were difficulty for the fire department to get to.
Hmm.
The streets, even at their best, they're crowded and narrow. You know.
That sounds right. Okay. Yeah, so the way that this place was set up, they wanted it to be like a tropical jazzy feeling,
Hmm.
right?
Yep.
And so, and you got to keep in mind the times here. It sounds really tacky to me when I hear it described, but they had like satin drapery all over the walls. They had bamboo and rattan on the walls as well.
Yep.
They had all these fake paper palm trees that were actually big. I don't know if you've seen some of the pictures. There's one with like the maitre d' standing in front of one of the palm trees, and it's like
Hmm.
all the way up to the ceiling.
Yep.
They had false ceilings, so you'd have like the drop ceiling,
Hmm.
and that was made out of like leatherette, which is like basically plastic,
Yep.
and satin as well. So just everything flammable. And apparently, what they said was that, all of these materials were like tested. And basically, when they test them, you have to like treat these materials for flame retardant. And even
Hmm.
in like the 40s,
Right.
they were doing that. But the way they tested this, and you can kind of imagine from all of the other under the table stuff they were doing, they basically just kind of lit a match and held it near it and said, "Nope, didn't go up. It's fine."
Yep.
You know. And then they
Hmm.
put all that stuff up. And like when you have flame retardant chemicals on materials, it's not like you just apply that once. For clothing, you would just apply that once, but for like draperies and things like that, you would have to reapply that every once in a while
Yep.
in order for it to be effective. And it doesn't look like they ever did that. There's no evidence they ever kind of did that. So it had restaurant, bars, dance floors. It actually had like a roof that you could go up to,
Hmm.
like a roof, probably like a roof bar space. And there was the Melody Lounge, which was in the basement, like a sub basement. And that's the one that had the revolving stage. They had all those underage boys that were servers, busboys, and security.
Hmm.
But where you're half above board and half below board, they had to take certain precautions. And the kind of precautions they wanted to take would be to brick up and lock up all of the exits in this building.
Yep.
He was really concerned with people like drinking and dashing, and just like
Yep.
get your drinks, get your food, and then take off. Because if it was a popular place, it would be crowded and it would be hard to keep track of people. So he's
Yep.
like, all right, I'm just gonna like board up all the emergency exits. There was one emergency exit that had like it had like a mechanism where you could get out, and that mechanism was bolted down.
Right. Hmm.
So, I mean, even in the standards of the time, I imagine anybody looking at that from a safety perspective would have thought, Jesus Christ, like,
Yeah, well, they had revolving doors, and a lot of the doors
yes.
open inward rather than outward.
That's correct. Yeah, like
Yeah.
between all the rooms, there were all these inward opening doors, which at the time was not even that wasn't like there were no regulations against that anyways. But it's just you're opening a door from a big, huge space. You might want to open it outwards. I don't know. It's just kind of
Yeah.
an idea.
Yeah.
Um, well, we talked about the capacity. Um,
Yep.
it was really crowded. And of course you've got all of that decoration there. You've got all the tables there. You've got all the people there. Capacity was 460 people, and there were over 1,000 people on November 28th, 1942 in this building.
Yep.
Which is you just look, we know we're talking about a fire here, but even if I didn't say to you in the beginning that this was about a fire, somebody's gonna be like, "Whoa, what's gonna happen? This is not good."
No, not good at all, and the other part was even if the doors were uh, properly set up, they still were bolting them and locking them so that people couldn't
Yep.
get up because they their philosophy, and it just probably ties into the mob influence where they just didn't trust people, so they wanted to make sure that people would not try to get out without paying,
Right.
and so
Yeah, that seemed to have been the focus. Despite this, a lot of people really loved it and it was very popular. The night of November 28th, 1942, it was hopping. Like I said, it was like more than double capacity. It was
yep,
just packed in like sardines. The music was playing, but also Arthur Blake was sort of the headline act, and he was actually just coming up on his fame at the time. So Arthur Blake was, it's funny because Wikipedia just listed him as a female impersonator, which, I mean, yes, he did do impersonations of famous women, but he also did impersonations of men as well. So he's basically like he was a nightclub act, he was a comedian, he was like an entertainer.
right,
He is one of the few entertainers of the time who was just as respected in both the straight community and the gay community, which is pretty cool. I read up on him a little bit. He performed in a lot of nightclubs, and it was really funny about him when I did a little bit of research. One of his more famous impersonations was of Eleanor Roosevelt,
yep, yep.
and it became such a popular impersonation that President Roosevelt invited him to the White House to perform, uh, which is very cool. And Betty Davis, did you see the quote about Betty Davis?
Yep, yep,
She said, they asked her, because Betty Davis was impersonated a lot.
right.
She had a very distinctive way of speaking and moving. So what somebody once asked her how she felt about impersonators, and she said, I kind of learn a lot from them. And talking about Arthur Blake, she said, I never knew I moved my elbows so much. And he also did like Lionel Barrymore, Jimmy Stewart, Peter Lorre.
Right,
And he had roles in several Hollywood films in the
right.
like the 40s and 50s. So he was there playing. Okay, so I think we've kind of set up the scene there a little bit. You can imagine
Yeah,
this place.
yeah. It was yes. It had a lot of stuff going against it. And you talk about famous people. I guess the college football team was a BC had was supposed to go there for a celebration. They ended up not going there.
Oh, right.
Um,
Because they lost the game, I think.
right, yeah, they lost the
Yeah,
game. Yeah, yeah,
right. Boston College lost the game, so they didn't end up going. And Mayor Tobin was supposed to be there
right,
that night, and he canceled his plans because apparently he was a Boston College fan,
right,
which is like, okay, well, I guess that's lucky. But so if there were over 1,000 people in there that night, how many more people were supposed to be there that night?
right,
That's
right.
kind of crazy. So, when it comes to the origins of the fire, there were multiple stories, and actually, they discovered more information much, much, much later. And I'm not even sure. I had watched a documentary about this when I was a kid, and this
Mhm.
was one of those PBS sort of history documentaries that used to be on whenever they had, probably whenever they had Pledge Week. So, because I watched it several times. And they talked about the fire being started by this busboy, Tomaszewski.
Yeah, Tomaziski, yeah,
Tomaszewski. And they thought basically the story was that there was a couple and they were sort of in a little secluded table in the corner and they wanted a little privacy to kiss. And so they unscrewed the light bulb so that they could be a little bit darker in there. And apparently the busboy, who was like 16 years old, he was told, like probably by the maitre d', go fix that light bulb. And I guess he went over, couldn't see the bulb, and he lit a match. And then I don't know, the way they said it in the documentary was like, he lit the match and then he just, I don't know, threw the match or something, you know, and that's how the fire started. But I think they found later, and this should not be a surprise to anybody. I mean, it would be a surprise if the thing got lit up by a candle on the table,
right,
but it really shouldn't be a surprise to learn that it was probably an electrical issue. It was probably
right,
faulty wiring. They found when they were investigating later, there's like photographic evidence. They looked at the photographic evidence years later and saw like the origin of the fire was like up against the wall near one of the palm trees. And it was clearly from like the HVAC system
right.
and the wiring in the system. And I guess Freon was in short supply during this time. This is
Yep, during
1942.
World War II, yeah.
I don't know what they would have used. I mean, what were they using Freon for during the war? Was it cooling
Well,
machinery or what?
yeah, probably cooling machinery, compressors. It's using compressors, you know.
Okay, okay.
So, there is, it's always the case with Freon. Anytime, Freon has been proven and tested over the years to be, pretty reliable and fairly safe.
Yeah,
But when you substitute anything for it, you really open yourself up to issues that you just can't anticipate. You know,
right.
and I think that's what they did was they had substituted the Freon for another material which is more flammable.
Yeah, I think it was
Um,
methyl chloride, which I don't
yeah,
know
methyl
much
chloride.
about.
Yeah, I don't
Um,
either. So
but I guess it's a flammable gas. So,
yeah, yeah, and you can just from looking at the details, it's all the things that when we hear about stories, and actually you see more documentation nowadays on how fires start and what happens in fire starts, and how fire is oxygen hungry,
yeah,
and then the efforts that folks do to try to deal with it ends up feeding the fire and causing it to really take off, which trying to put out, probably trying to put out the fire. I think we've seen some details.
hmm,
They pulled down curtains and ceiling, and once they pulled the ceiling down,
right,
now you've got an area for the fire looking for oxygen, and it
right.
just flows along the top of the ceiling, and then just goes everywhere at that point, and it becomes a fireball, which like instant. That's really it spreads to the false ceiling,
Hmm.
uh, and it just burns. And then what happens is that you get the fabric that's on the ceiling burning and dropping onto the patrons and dropping onto other flammable material that's sitting in the club itself, without even talking about the fact that you got alcohol,
Oh, exactly. And the smoke too. I mean,
smoke. Yeah, smoke usually that's the thing that
that's the thing that
gets
gets
people
you.
initially. Yeah.
Yes, in any fire. And but this particular fire isn't just like wood, you know. This
Yeah.
is like all of these materials like satin and just plastic and I mean in the 40s just all of these like they were just kind of starting to use like artificial synthetic materials back then.
Mm-hmm.
So it
Yep.
was like all the rage to use that stuff, plus all the paper. And like you said, as soon as they pulled down those, like the false ceiling, it's just whoosh, you know.
Yeah.
Um, and so many people around, they were trying to crawl around, but the flames just like went way too fast. And you mentioned before the revolving door. That was the only entrance, is a one small
Right.
revolving door, which, as we know about revolving door, first of all, revolving doors scare the crap out of me, anyways,
Yep. Yep.
because they move so slowly, and you're just like not. I don't know. What if that thing gets stuck? You're stuck
Well,
in between two things, that's just
yeah.
under normal circumstances. Like,
Frequently in normal circumstances, it gets stuck. If you have somebody, this wouldn't happen in this case, but you've got somebody coming in as you're trying to go out, and a lot
yeah,
of times it gets stuck. So you can just imagine hundreds of people trying to get out this exit all at the same time,
right.
and they're all in a panic as it is. You
Yep.
know, the,
And they're just running around. And, so the entrance ways that come out of the ballrooms and things were, as you said, they open inward. So people are pushing up against there. And then of course you're trying to push up against a door, you collapse from smoke inhalation or flames. You're on the floor now, blocking the door. And then just bodies just stacking up against those doors. So these people were trapped. The staff, I guess I read on one of the sources, out of the people who survived, there were more staff, who were able to get out because they knew about this maze. They knew all the entrances and exits. They knew how to navigate around here. There were a couple of staff members that I didn't learn until this yesterday when I was doing my extra research. They had hidden in the walk-in cooler.
right. Yeah, which you don't think of, but as a staff, they just know, and I think that that's the other side of it. It's there were just ways to escape, which, folks who patrons wouldn't know that. And back to the doors operating inward, fire department officials said that if the doors had opened
Hmm.
outward, at least 300 lives would have been saved. So think about that. It's just like,
That's most of the
that
people who
that's most
died.
of the people that died.
Yeah, because it was like what, 426 or something
400
like
and
that.
something, yeah,
400 and something who died. I mean, it was terrible. I mean, you can just imagine, but it was just terrible.
yeah,
The crowd stampeded against the revolving door. They jammed it, the door broke. So as the people were piling up against the door and pushing against the door, the revolving door finally broke, which then opened up to the outside and sent a bunch of oxygen rushing in,
and it feeds the fire. Yeah,
and it
yeah,
fed the fire, and anybody who was right there gone right
yeah,
after that,
got burned instantly. Yeah,
just
yeah,
burned. Yeah, the firemen had to, they couldn't even get near the door. They had to like douse the flames in front of the door before they could even get in. All the side doors were bolted shut. There was a plate glass window, it was boarded up,
hmm,
locked. All the other unlocked doors were, like I said, opened inwards. And so, so many people just it must have been just absolutely horrific. So there were, nearby businesses, of course, people tried to come and assist. There were a lot of like soldiers and
hmm,
sailors around,
yep,
which we talked about in the molasses flood as well.
yep,
I mean, I know, Boston's got a lot of water. So
hmm,
he's got a lot
yep,
of navy. He's got a lot of soldiers around. There's a lot of there's a lot of activity around with the military. So they seemed like there were always, and of course the war, there were always soldiers around to help. And I guess it must have been amazing for them to jump to action like that and try to do everything they could before like the fire department could get there. They were treated, of course, for their injuries, trying to help people. When the fire department did finally show up, they did have a difficult time getting into the building to try and put out the fire. And then, of course, it's nighttime, and it was November. It was the end of November. So it was cold, and the water, the water from the hoses
yeah,
started freezing, and some of the hoses froze to the ground.
yeah,
So, I mean, it's awful. They started using newspaper trucks as ambulances. Because you imagine there would have been a lot more newspaper trucks around than ambulances in those days in Boston.
yeah,
They hosed down people's bodies without cold water. And this was actually, it was pretty gruesome, but it was very striking to read. The victims, when they were inside the building, they had breathed like the hot smoke and the hot fumes. It was so hot. When they finally got outside, the cold air just like shocked their system so much that they just dropped,
yeah,
which is just horrific but fascinating. And I can imagine, like I said before, the smoke and the fumes that were inside that building was so much worse, lending to the materials that were inside. The other horrific thing that I read about was, in the aftermath when the firefighters were coming in, there were a whole bunch of people sitting at their seats at tables with drinks in their hands,
yeah,
dead, which is just like it gives you a picture of just how quickly this all happened.
yeah.
They didn't even have a chance to, they didn't even have a chance to get up out of their seat. And they probably couldn't because there were so many people there. Uh, so crazy, absolutely crazy. We didn't mention this before, but the other person who wasn't in the club was the owner of the club, Walensky.
The
He was
lawyer, yeah.
actually, yeah, the lawyer. He was actually in the hospital already,
Mm.
recovering from a heart attack. He was at Mass General. That's pretty awful. And it's pretty interesting to me.
Yeah, you were talking about the methyl chloride. It
Yes.
wasn't until the 1990s that a former Boston firefighter and researcher, Charles Kenny, had discovered that the methylene chloride was used as a substitute for the freon. They didn't realize
Hmm.
it wasn't part of their initial investigation. And yeah, he was the one that came up with that as being
As being the
it, it,
cause,
yeah, and
possible
it's just
cause. Yeah.
it's it's consistent. The combustion of the methyl chloride was consistent with some of the aspects of the fire. which is, flame color, smoke, and inhalation systems, inhalation symptoms, that which kind of explains why it flashed, almost like a gasoline fire.
Oh, sure. Oh, absolutely. And of course, there's probably no record of them switching out the Freon for the methyl chloride because they did everything they did everything without permits, you know.
You could just imagine, that somebody says, okay, we can't get Freon, and somebody else says, well, we can get this stuff. Okay, get it. And
Yeah,
yeah,
it's pretty awful.
yeah.
Of course, I mean, the victims, it was horrific for them. A lot of people died quickly, but you know, some people were severely burned. One of the notable victims, I don't like his story, but his story kind of touched me. He was a Coast Guardsman, and he had gone back into the building, it says no fewer than 4 times in search of his date. He thought he was, trying to find her. He thought she was still in there, but she had actually gotten out. But he kept going back in to try and find her to try and save her, which I think was very sweet. He had third-degree burns over 55% of his body, but he survived,
Mhm.
and he became the most severely burned person to survive. He spent 21 months in the hospital. He had several hundred operations, and he ended up marrying his nurse. And sad, and that's the good part of the story because I read that and I was like all touched, and then I read the next piece. 14 years later, he burned to death in a fiery automobile
Okay,
crash. Can
right.
you frickin' imagine?
He just could not get away from that, his life event, I guess.
That's
So,
so awful. It's so
yeah,
awful. But it was very touching that he tried to save his date, and
yep.
then he recovered after so much terrible, terrible pain and all the surgeries and everything. He married his nurse, he found happiness, and then it was just like, gosh.
Well, in the aftermath, which
Yeah,
is always the case, is investigations and figure it, and
right.
eventually what happens is somebody gets charged
Yep,
with crimes, which was Barney.
right.
He got convicted of 19 counts of manslaughter.
Wow.
Uh, they they just chose 19 random victims.
Correct.
Uh,
I saw that. Yeah,
yeah,
which is, I mean, it's sad, but what are you going to do?
yeah,
What are you going
yeah,
to do? Have 426 trials or whatever? Like you
yeah,
can't,
yeah.
you know.
It does.
But
Yeah,
yeah, that's pretty terrible. And originally they were originally they were accusing Stanley Tomaszewski, who was the busboy.
right.
He was underage. He shouldn't have been working there, but he testified it. He was exonerated.
Yeah.
Exonerated, but of course, he was ostracized for a
Well,
lot of
yeah,
his life.
that doesn't go away even if you're exonerated.
Right,
So,
because not everybody gets that memo.
yeah, that's right.
It's pretty sad. But yeah, so they did try Wolanski. He was sentenced to 12 to 15 years in prison in 1943, and he served 4 years, and he was pardoned by Tobin,
Right.
who
Mhm.
was then the governor of Massachusetts. But he died 9 weeks after his release because he had cancer. So,
Right. Yeah, and the other side, the other part is like the effects of it, which is changing safety laws. Laws were
yes.
changed, so that they established, they banned flammable decorations,
Hmm.
inward swinging doors, just what we talked about, exit signs everywhere,
Yeah.
revolving doors used for egress only. It must be flanked by at least one normal out swinging door.
Yes, I was going
Uh,
to mention that because if you see a revolving door nowadays, there's always a regular door, at least one
right,
on the side, which I
right,
always use, by the way. I will not do revolving doors. I'm
yeah,
terrified of them.
yeah,
But I think that came from this. Yes.
right. Yes, and so they and another which is side is that the licensing board ruled that no Boston established could call itself the Cocoanut Grove. You know,
Which is
uh,
very
and,
interesting. That was like a touching part. I
mhm,
felt. I
yeah,
mean, that's the way I read it. I mean, there were plenty of other coconut groves because when you try to do the research, there's like hundreds of places that have been called the Coconut Grove outside
right,
of Boston.
right.
But I thought, and I also thought that that was a very Boston thing.
Oh yeah, Yeah,
Very Boston
yeah,
thing to do. It's like retiring somebody's number, you know.
yep. Yeah, and the other like Boston thing to do is Mass General Hospital,
Hmm.
Boston City Hospital, by the way, which is where I was born,
Oh,
received the majority, 83% of the victims
yep.
from the fire. Boston area hospitals, other Boston area hospitals received a total of about 30 patients.
Mhm.
Peter Benpringer Hospital, Beth Israel, Cambridge City Hospital, Kenmore Hospital, Faulkner Hospital, St. Elizabeth's Hospital, Malden Hospital, Massachusetts Memorial Hospital, Kearney, St. Margaret's,
Hmm.
MGA took in 114, Mass General Hospital took in 114 burn victims,
Hmm.
burn and
Yep.
smoke inhalation victims, and Boston's hospital received over 300. And it was estimated that one casualty arrived at Boston City Hospital every 11 seconds.
That's
And
crazy.
it is crazy. Another, which is I'm sort of getting to the side thing, is that Boston, they were ready for this. They were well prepared
Hmm.
because they had done drawn up emergency plans in preparation for attacks along the East Coast in case, the Luftwaffe had bombed them,
Oh,
and
right.
so they were set up to handle this, even though they didn't have triage. They were set up to handle it, and they had a change of shift, and so they had a double complement of nurses and support staff. But nonetheless, most patients died en route to the hospital shortly after arrival.
Right.
Thing that I wanted to mention here when I started getting into this is that none of these hospitals charged any of the victims for the hospital stays.
That's amazing. That's something that would not happen today.
Absolutely would not happen. No,
No.
absolutely.
And of course, like instead of that, there would just be some kind of big lawsuit that would award a whole bunch of money that the victims would never get, you know?
Yeah, it's just, they had established, they had in preparation, they had just established in April of that year, a blood bank. So
Hmm.
they had over 200 units of dry plasma in preparation for the war.
Right.
And they used 147 units, treating only 29 patients. So it was just, regardless of, the tragedy, there was a preparation that had been done in advance that saved lives, I'm sure. I mean,
Hmm.
they still had, of the 444 burn victims that were hospitalized, only 130 survived.
Right.
Uh,
But
but
the community looks like it came together too because
yes,
1,200 people donated over 3,800 units of blood to that blood bank,
yep,
which is
yep.
amazing in the days after the fire.
Yeah, and like I said, the hospitals chose not to charge.
Hmm.
And then the Red Cross provided financial assistance to both public and private hospitals to supplement whatever cost that came up,
Hmm.
So
Yeah,
it's
and then we talked about the regulations that came about because of this, the fire regulations, but also the medical advancements that came as a result of having to do this. For
yeah.
burn patients and smoke inhalation patients. This kind of reminds me of like war, post-war medical advancements, like
Mhm.
especially you always think about the Civil War, where there
Right.
was a huge jump in medical advancement right after the Civil War, because of a lot of things, like germ theory and things like that, but also because you see so much during a disaster or during a war that you have to like come up with ways of treating people.
Well,
Um,
yeah, and that's what I was talking about earlier,
yeah.
where they do nowadays with triage.
Yes.
Basically what happens with triage does it. You may think it's heartless, but some people think it might be heartless, but it's a proper way to do it. Is that someone comes in and they don't spend a lot of time with that person because there was no chance that they would be able to
Right.
survive.
Well, and also
Uh,
prioritizing the most urgent
yeah,
cases.
the most urgent care,
Right.
what
Right.
all the things that go into triage, which is someone who's not based in hospital care or medical field, I'm not entirely familiar with, so I don't want to speak about exactly all the things that happen. But
Right.
it just the triage part of it is the evaluation. Okay, what do you do? Bingo, send it
Hmm.
here, send it there, whatever you're gonna do.
Exactly. And I mean, I guess somebody could see that as heartless too. what you were mentioning about if
Uh,
somebody's too far gone, but I don't know if that's heartless because if you were to take all of your staff and all of your effort to try and save one person's life who was not going to survive, I
mhm.
guess that is noble, but then how many people die in the meantime
Right,
while
right,
all of your staff is helping that
yeah,
person? So it's heartless, but it's not.
right,
It's just unfortunately, the way that things have to go sometimes in an emergency situation, you
yeah.
have to assess the priorities. So, yeah, it's just it's amazing the things that came out of this. And I mean, it was a terrible, terrible night, but as you see over and over again, that
Yeah.
disasters can create a silver lining in advancements and lessons learned. Sometimes lessons get learned from history every once in a while.
Sometimes they get learned from history. It's right. And that's really where philosophy, I always look at the philosophy is that you take what has happened in the past and you learn from the lessons. Experience is like having done that before.
Right.
Or having seen that before. That's what experience is all about. And some people say it's having made that mistake before. So there's all those things that come into play, but that's how you learn. That's how you advance, and
Mhm.
that's how things get better.
And speaking of learning and advancements, I didn't know this until literally just now. 13 survivors of the fire were among the first humans to be treated with penicillin.
Oh, I didn't know that. It's
Isn't that
interesting.
amazing? So,
Yeah, it
yeah,
is.
this is right around the time when penicillin was brand new. Merck rushed a 32-liter supply of the drug in the form of culture liquid that the penicillium mold had been grown from New
Mhm.
Jersey to Boston. And
Well,
they were giving them low doses because, of course, they didn't really understand antibiotics.
right,
Antibiotics are
right.
brand new.
Mhm.
They started using sulfadiazine and this penicillin was brand new, but they were giving them kind of low doses like on a regular basis, and a lot of those people probably their lives were saved with the help of the antibiotics.
Right. Yeah,
It's amazing.
absolutely.
Some advancements came with psychiatry as well after this because of the trauma of something like this. There was a paper published, which has now become like what scholars in this field call a classic, symptomatology and management of acute grief. And so we talked about this in our last episode. Psychiatry wasn't really focusing in the 40s yet about uh, on post-traumatic stress disorder,
Yep, yep.
survivors of trauma, survivors of war, survivors of events. That was never really considered something. Maybe they thought they couldn't do anything about it, but it was still so new. Uh, the study of this came about because of this fire as well. There were so many people that they could treat, they could observe and question. They used more than 500 survivors of the fire and published some of the earliest research on PTSD, which is very, very interesting. So I guess that's a good thing too. There were memorials put up. The complex, the building was torn down in 1944, and I guess the street looks different. It looks completely different than it did at the time because they kind of redid the streets.
Mhm.
Um, Streets were renamed or built over. But there is a plaque near the site of the fire, kind of right near the corner of the common.
Okay.
And you can see it has like a little outline of the building and how it was set up, and it has like a little paragraph about that. I think there's another one. I think there's more than one, but it says that much of the club's former footprint, including what was the main entrance, now lies under the Revere Hotel. I don't know if you know where that is, but that's
No, I don't. Yeah.
somewhere near Shawmut Street. It says the surviving section of Shawmut Street, newer extension cutting through what was the club's original footprint, were renamed Coconut Grove Lane in 2013. And there's condos there.
Huh.
It's like, yeah, those are
Okay.
some haunted ass condos. I'm
I'm
sorry. I don't
sure.
want to
Yeah.
live there.
Wow.
I don't know. I mean, I guess all of Boston's probably haunted at this
Yeah.
point. There's a lot of history there. But yeah, there was more than 490 people who died in the fire. So crazy. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think that the reason this story has stuck with me over the years isn't just because of the tragedy that happened. It isn't just because it's Boston, but I really think it's because of everything that's happened afterwards. I think it's like all of the advancements in medicine, the fire codes, improvements in just everything. I feel like it was probably, if you could look at history as an outsider and just see it go by, I could imagine you could see that as a real crossroads or a turning point. So it's very interesting to me. And I think that's probably why it stuck to me so much. That, and it's a fascinating story of people, people, of course, trying their best to survive in an impossible situation and people coming to help.
Yeah, and it just makes me think that how many times that you're somewhere, it's like the thing that most of us will see more often is when you're on a plane and they're describing all the exits and everything.
Yeah,
Uh, when we've taken cruises, sometimes it feels annoying, all this stuff they talk about, but it's really the safety part of it is very necessary because you just never know. So you want to, it's the be prepared for it, and that's where the safety comes into play. Uh,
right.
so these are all the things. So every time you think something's annoying, just try to think about what can possibly happen. And they had a fire in a nightclub in the outskirts of Boston
Hmm.
where correct, is it 100 people died or something like that, and it was sort of the same thing. I
Oh, is
think
this the one that was more recent? I mean, I knew some people in that fire. It was I forget the name of the band. It was like
White
a,
Snake, was it? No, not
not
White
White
Snake.
Snake. It was like
It
a
was
name
White
like
something.
that.
Yeah,
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 it was White something. And
yeah,
I knew some of the victims because they lived in the area of Rowley where I was working. That was just as horrific. That was pyrotechnics from the show
yep, yep,
caused that fire, and it was a small place, that club. It was like a little bar.
yep.
Same kind of thing. People were trapped up against doors. They couldn't get out. They were going out windows. But there were also a lot of inspiring stories that came from that
Yes.
incident too, that I
Yeah,
heard firsthand from one or
yeah.
two of the survivors that I knew personally, like people coming back in, strangers just reaching back in those windows and pulling people out. It was just amazing.
Yeah, and in spite of the fact that they had all the regulations, basically when they did the pyrotechnics, which they probably shouldn't have done, but
Hmm.
they had insulating padding on the walls, which really was
Yeah.
not fire retardant, which really got the fire going. So
Oh yeah. I mean, just awful.
yeah. Anyway, all those positive notes. There you go.
I know, I know. And I think yeah, that was in Rhode Island actually.
Yep.
That was
Mhm.
Great White was the name of
Great white. Okay. All right.
yeah. And that was in 2003, which, okay, that was a long time ago. And I was thinking that was recently.
Yeah,
I'm
well, see,
just,
that's now you start thinking 2003 is recently. Okay.
and I would have said about 10 years ago. I would have been like, oh, it was about 10 years ago. No, it wasn't, Lynette. You're just old. Everything is not 10 years ago anymore.
Yeah, yeah,
Everything is 20 or more years ago now.
that's right. Yeah,
Everything.
yeah,
Yeah, that's awful. And it was the Station nightclub, and it was the second deadliest nightclub fire in New England, right after the Cocoanut Grove fire in
right. Which
1942.
not surprising. But what's surprising is that it would have happened at all. That's
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, remember remember Wolanski there getting 19 counts? The tour manager of Great White pled guilty to 100 counts of involuntary manslaughter.
yep, yep.
And actually he also served 4 years out of a 15-year sentence. What is up?
I don't know. Just
I guess you might as well just tell, like 1,000 counts, a million counts,
yeah,
it doesn't matter. Anyway,
doesn't matter.
that's a soapbox I'm not getting on today.
Okay. Yep.
But yeah, so folks, that was the very, very tragic story, very dark story of the Coconut Grove fire. I encourage all of you to do more research on that. There are lots of documentaries out there. There's lots of articles out there that can give you more details. We were a little bit all over the place, but I think we did okay. Or I should say I was a little bit all over the place. Dad, you were just fine.
Well, the thing is, the thing is like you're just saying about you can research all the finer details. There are a lot of details, a lot of analysis of what went on. And if you're really interested, you can find the information online and
Yeah.
uh, you know and browse it to your heart's content.
Yeah.
In a way, I kind of feel like the way that we handled it was fills into one of my pet peeves was not to get into minutia of detail,
Hmm.
but just the various, just get in, just talk about what happened and, positive and negative parts of it, and try to summarize in our summary to come up with, you know, something positive. So,
That's true. That's true. I mean, minutia is sort of what we do here, though,
yes,
if we're
true.
going to be
Yeah.
honest. We have a podcast about trivia.
Yeah, but we could get worse.
We could get a lot worse.
That's my
I could
point.
definitely get worse, and I'm
Yeah.
going to take that challenge
Yeah.
in some way, of course. Um, but yeah, folks, and there's also a lot of photographs, like not graphic photographs, but like photographs of like the aftermath, and it's just if that's something you're interested, something amazing to see, like all the firefighters like trying to comb through all the records and stuff.
Yeah.
It's a lot of I like historical photos and things like that, so I'm super into that. But yeah, so check that out if you're interested. Send us an email if you were interested. Mochiverse at gmail.com. That's MOCCIAVERSE at gmail.com. And if you can, go on to Apple Podcasts and subscribe to us there and give us a rating there. And maybe tell your friends and family about this show that you listen to, that you're keeping a secret from everybody. They might want to hear it too. So, so do we have anything to lighten up the mood?
Yes, we do.
All right.
We're going to go punny today.
Oh, punny. I like punny.
Okay. Yeah. Old accountants never die. They
Uh,
just lose their balance.
oh boy.
Yeah, I know. Old quarterbacks never die. They just pass away.
uh,
Old milkmaids never die. They just kick the bucket.
they do.
Old game hosts never die, but they will be back after commercials. Old lawyers never die. They just lose their appeal.
Oh, I like that one.
Yeah, yeah. Old mediums never die. They just give up the ghost and lost their
Give
spirits.
up the ghost.
Old teachers never die. They just lose their class.
Oh my God.
Old mimes never die. They're
Yeah.
just never heard from again.
Oh, no.
Old dieters never die. They just waste away.
Oh, Christ.
Old baseball players never die. They just go batty. And this one here,
It's,
old hippies never die. They just smell that way.
oh, that's not nice. All right, folks. I think we've I think we've done enough damage today. We'll
That's right.
see you in a couple of weeks. Bye.
Bye bye.
Daddy wasn't finding a powwow. Daddy wasn't finding a powwow. I've got a little cat. I'm very fond of that. I'd rather have a pig. Bow wow.
I smell fine and I'm an old hippie. I mean, I haven't showered today, but I will
Yeah.
before I expose myself to any other humans.
Yeah.